Well, it's interesting to appear right now on these kinds of issues. First, I would say I don't think that the question of the Jewish vote as such is going to be so material in this election. Now, I've said that, even though it's pretty clear this is an election that's going to be quite close, and from my standpoint, I would actually prefer to talk a little bit more about the two candidates as it relates to the broad Middle East. You're going to watch a debate tonight, I think, and I think you're going to assume that there are really very broad distinctions between the candidates. And as I try to go through each of the issues in the Middle East, I wonder whether there are such clear distinctions between the two. If I take a step back and I ask, all right, come January, let's assume we have either President Obama is reelected or Governor Romney is elected, how different are they actually going to be as it relates to some of the core issues that matter? Let's take Iran to start with. Notwithstanding all of the interest in a New York Times piece that was reported yesterday about an agreement on there being one-on-one negotiations between Iran and the United States sometime after the election, A, I don't think there is such an agreement. B, having just said what I said, I'm also going to be completely unsurprised should there be negotiations that take place after the election. Because the fact of the matter is, it doesn't matter who's president. If you take a look at both sides' positions, the president and Governor Romney both agree that prevention of Iran from having a nuclear weapon, not containment, meaning you prevent them from acquiring this capability, you don't contain them after they have it after the fact. Both of them agree that the objective should be prevention. Now, if diplomacy doesn't work, that leads you where? I'll pose the question to you. If diplomacy doesn't work and you've declared that your objective is prevention, not containment, where does that lead you? It leads you to the use of force. It is inconceivable to me that whoever is president won't try one more very significant diplomatic initiative to ensure that, A, either you test the proposition that there is no agreement there, and or actually you prove that there could be an agreement, which, by the way, I think there is a possibility there could be an agreement, and I can get back to that if you want, or B, you do it because you want to demonstrate that you went the extra mile. And I want to digress for a second just to sort of remind you that, in fact, presidents in most cases will not resort to the use of force until they've demonstrated unmistakably, not just internationally but domestically, that they've exhausted every means short of the use of force. George H.W. Bush, before he launched the Gulf War, I happened to have been with Secretary Baker on a 3-week trip around the world to ensure that we could produce an all necessary means resolution in the Security Council. The night after that was concluded, not the night after, the morning after that was concluded around midnight. We returned to Washington. The first thing that the president wanted to do was to see Baker in the morning, and he said to him, great job getting the international community to get us an all necessary means resolution, but I've got to show the American public that we went the extra mile. It is inconceivable to me that we won't see either President Obama or Governor Romney want there to be some kind of more direct diplomatic engagement with the Iranians that puts some kind of endgame proposal on the table that allows the Iranians to have civil nuclear power, but restricts it in a way that prevents them from being able to break out to have a nuclear weapons capability. So I think both will do that. Both will increase the economic pressure. Both will do more to say if diplomacy fails, we're prepared to use force. And both, in all likelihood, will seek to have some kind of one last shot at trying to produce a diplomatic outcome. So in Iran, whatever you hear tonight, I don't actually believe there's going to be very much difference in terms of what the actual approaches will be. Tonight you'll hear a tonal difference, I suspect, but Governor Romney has no interest, knowing that the public is generally war weary for understandable reasons, in suggesting that he's going to be in a rush to engage in war. By the way, if he gets elected only for one reason, the economy. So you think he's going to rush into a conflict with Iran, given what the potential economic implications that could be? I think it's highly unlikely. So on Iran, I don't see a big difference. How about the broader Arab awakening? A big difference there? Well, I think you're going to hear probably Governor Romney highlight the importance of American leadership, which I think is always important. I think, no one else can play the role that we do in the world. That's just a fact. Madeleine Albright likes to refer to the United States as the indispensable nation, and the truth is on most issues, when there are problems, if the U.S. isn't the one that organizes the international community, it doesn't get organized. But the idea that, that we can solve every problem everywhere around the world is probably something that is self-evident that we can't. And the idea that it's just a case of asserting our leadership as opposed to how we will demonstrate it, I think it's easy to say it and not always so easy to carry it out. So what does it mean in terms of the Arab awakening? Where will you see differences? On Syria, if you look at what Governor Romney has said, he's said basically that he will do more to ensure that that arms get to the Syrian opposition. And if you look at his speech basically made it clear that it would be others who would provide the arms, not us. Now, the Obama administration has been obviously hesitant to provide arms, and they've said they have been providing non-lethal assistance. There are all sorts of stories out there that they're quietly beginning to trying to do more to vet things. This is an issue, I would say, where I basically think that both are not doing what is necessary. The fact is, obviously, Romney's not in a position to do something, but the way he's describing this, he still wants to work through others. I think where we're headed in Syria at this point is a failed state. And our ability to influence that goes down every day unless we are the ones who, in fact, are at least providing lethal assistance to those that we would identify. Is it risky to do it? Yes. It's more risky not to do it, given what the consequences of a failed state are likely to be. And we have an interest in trying to influence the balance of forces that are within Syria today. The opposition, day by day, becomes, in a sense, weighted more towards radical Islamists. And if you listen to some of those, and I've met some of those who are in the opposition, who basically say they believe their revolution would fail if, in fact, Assad goes down, but the radical Islamists take over. But they also say they don't have the means, militarily or economically, to compete with the money and the weapons that are flowing in to those who are much more extreme. If we want to influence that situation, then at a minimum, we ought to be doing more to try to provide the means to these groups. Does it mean you simply go and you provide them man pads, which are portable surface-to-air missiles? No, because the next thing that may happen is that you could see civilian airliners being shot down. But we should test the proposition. We should basically try to create one unified address for all assistance that is provided. That means trying to bring the Saudis, the Qataris, and the Turks together. So there's one address for when there's a request for assistance. And the second thing is we ought to create a set of circumstances where those who are prepared to provide materials to, they have to make a series of commitments. They have to account for all the weapons that are provided. And you can test whether they live up to this or they don't. But to think that we can sit back and stay on the current path we are on and watch as the situation will continue to deteriorate, which it will in Syria, because the longer this has dragged on, the worse the violence has become, the deeper the sectarian divide, the less the central institutions of the state have any real role, is, I think, an illusion. So here again, I think what you're going to find is that both the President and Governor Romney, whoever emerges, as this situation gets worse and as the risk of the violence within Syria begins to radiate more outward. We saw it in this terrible bombing in Lebanon. We're seeing it increasingly on the Turkish-Syrian border. The idea that this is a conflict that's going to stay only within Syria is an illusion. It will affect Lebanon. It will affect Turkey. It will affect Jordan. It will affect Iraq for sure. We're already seeing it. And at some point it will affect Israel as well. So whoever is elected is going to end up having to do more on Syria. What about Egypt? What's the right approach on Egypt? Here I think each of them tonight are likely to say, we should identify with those forces that embody our values. I think that Governor Romney will probably try to criticize the president and suggest that he's been too open to the Muslim Brotherhood, and he will impose greater conditionality. I think if, in fact, Governor Romney gets in, the idea of conditionality, by the way, makes sense, but will you cut off the Egyptian military? It's a really good question. You know, we cut off the Pakistani military with a Pressler member, and the result of that is for a generation we lost all ability to influence the Pakistani military. Has that turned out to be a good thing for the United States? That's a rhetorical question. So my point is, the more you look at these issues, you're going to find the range of choice for them is not so great. Now, there is one issue that will come up, and that is Israel. Romney likes to say that the president has thrown Israel under the bus. Foreign policy is usually about substance and not slogans, but in campaigns it's usually about slogans and not substance. You know, I think have there been differences between the administration and the president and the prime minister? Yeah. But when it comes to what I would call the fundamentals of the relationship, which start with the issue of security, it's simply a fact that no administration has done more for Israel, both for Israel and with Israel, than this one. I would say, secondly, I've worked with every Israeli prime minister over the last 30 years, which means that I started as a child prodigy. It also means that I've worked with basically every American president during that period, with the exception of George W. Bush, 43. And the one thing I've seen is that no administration and no Israeli administration ever agree all the time. And I'll pose a question to you. How many people here think Ronald Reagan was a good friend of Israel? Just raise your hand. How many people have no opinion? I think the general assessment would be that Ronald Reagan was a very good friend of Israel. But he suspended F-16 sales to Israel over the Assyric bombing, the bombing of the reactor in Iraq. He presented the Reagan plan on peace, which is the only plan that actually bore his name during his presidency, over in Menachem Begin's opposition. And yet, if you were to poll any Israeli today, they say Ronald Reagan was a good friend of Israel, and they'd be right, because he was a good friend of Israel. Strategic cooperation with Israel was begun during the Reagan administration and reversed what had been the history prior to that time. People tend to forget. We think that the U.S.-Israeli relationship is something that always existed. The fact of the matter is the very first administration to provide arms, and it took a big debate within it, to Israel was the Kennedy administration. And that was only defensive missiles. He broke the taboo on providing arms. We weren't the biggest provider of economic assistance to the Israelis. The Germans were. It doesn't change until after Camp David. So this wasn't always a given. But the fact is, a special relationship was developed. Reagan was clearly a friend of Israel, even though he had differences. Was Bill Clinton? How many people here, since maybe there are younger people here who will remember more recent times? Bob, I noted your hand, so I just want you to know. How many people here think that Bill Clinton was a friend of Israel? We have a lot of people who just don't want to raise their hands. Well, I think if you were to poll Israelis, actually Bill Clinton could run today in Israel and probably beat anybody running. That might be true here as well. But there were times when Bill Clinton actually wouldn't even see the Prime Minister of Israel because he was mad at him. One time their planes were parked next to each other in LA and he wouldn't see him and he wouldn't talk to him. But he was a friend of Israel because you have ups and downs in any relationship. What matters is what are the fundamentals like, and the fundamentals are very strong. And so I would say on this, I suspect the president will, if Governor Romney challenges him on this, I am quite certain that the president will go through and he will define what he's done for and with Israel. And the point is, whoever is president of the United States is going to have a certain kind of relationship with Israel. And I would say now, this is even more true. I mentioned the Arab awakening. What does the Arab awakening suggest more than anything else? First, that it wasn't an Arab Spring. Secondly, that it's more about upheaval and transformation than anything else. And is there one country in the region that we know will be a country we can count on at this point? There is one, and it's Israel. And that creates almost by definition a certainty of what the character of the relationship will be. So here again, I would say for all the talk, I don't think there's going to be a big difference. Even on the issue, will President Obama in his second term suddenly decide that he's going to pursue a very active approach to pursuing peace, whereas Governor Romney wouldn't? First, we don't know what Governor Romney would do because he hasn't really talked much about it. Secondly, I think one of the things, if you go back at the end of the first term, I mean, I'm sorry, this is the first term, at the end of the first year of the Obama term, he gave an interview where he said one of the things he learned is that it was a lot more difficult to try to achieve peace in the Middle East than he thought when he came in. And my guess is that he will do what he can, but he's not going to try to create an opportunity where there isn't one. So I guess my bottom line assessment to you is watch tonight, see how wrong I was or how right I was. But I think the tone will be different. I think you'll see an effort to try to create more of a sense of difference than the reality suggests. And what it comes down to fundamentally is the following. There are constraints on what the real choices are. We will be active in this region because we have to be. But the reality is the choices we have are going to be limited, and no matter who is president, they're going to confront those same sets of constraints and those same sets of choices. And my guess is the fundamental policy will not be as different as they may be trying to suggest that it will be.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Ross. Very insightful analysis. Professor Lieber.
Dennis, that, as usual, that was a terrific talk. There's much to agree with, especially about the objective analysis of what America's interests and constraints represent, and how, for example, on dealing with Iran and the Iran nuclear program, the similarities are very, I think, real. But, and the but is there a danger that actually the use of force in a conflict may be greater with Obama than with Romney, for the following reason. If they both say that having a nuclear weapon is unacceptable, not to be contained. Because he represents what is symbolically a more hawkish position, the Iranians may find more credibility in any threat emanating from Romney. And of course, we're just speculating grossly because so much is up in the air. But for a variety of reasons, the Iranians now may not take Obama as seriously that when the chips are down, he would follow through in the way that they fear that an Obama might.
A Romney might.
Sorry, no, a Romney might.
Yeah. I would say two things. One, to take on specifically what you're saying, but another which actually is coming at it from a somewhat different perspective, but leads to the same conclusion. Let me start with that and then come back to what you were raising. I touched on it before when I said if Governor Romney gets elected, he gets elected for one reason, the economy. It's hard to imagine someone who gets elected because of the economy is going to look for an early opportunity to use force, particularly in this part of the world, given what its implications could be on oil prices and therefore the effect on the economy. Number one. Number two, he's not lived with this issue for the last 4 years the way President Obama has. He's not thought it through and had a circle of people around him with whom he's had discussions, intensive discussions, on an ongoing basis, thinking through every aspect of this issue the way President Obama has. And by the way, that would be true for any challenger. It's not unique to Governor Romney. It's true for any challenger. Three, when he comes in, he actually has to establish an administration. He has to get all of his various people in place. And so it's almost inevitable that he will be much slower off the mark on this issue than President Obama because he has to set up an administration, whereas where the president is simply, he may have a different lineup, but he's continuing. And the issue is not new to him. So I think that it will take him longer, and I think he's much less likely to want to rush into it. Now, the question you're raising is, because the Iranians might think he's more prone to use force, will that make them more likely to look for a diplomatic way out? And I do think that the key to a diplomatic solution, which I still believe is possible, is not only the economic pressures, which they're feeling in a very acute way, and I can detail all of that if you like, but also that they believe that we fear the failure of diplomacy less than they do. And it may be that they perceive the president one way. My suspicion is that they have decided, well, they think the president's tough language is a function of the elections. And after the elections, what they're going to find out is it's not. And they will then suddenly have to come to grips with what they thought was the case is not the case. I will tell you also, they have historically viewed, with the one exception being George W. Bush, they have historically viewed Republicans more favorably than they've viewed Democrats, because they think, well, Republicans are businessmen, they know their interests. Literally, that's, I think, an Iranian perception. So I guess the bottom line is I don't know exactly how they will perceive Romney, but they're also likely to sort of see, all right, what does he do when he comes in? And it gives them a sense that they've got a few more months to wait and see. With Obama, that's less likely to be the case. And I also think one other thing, having been a part of those debates in which the president made the decision over prevention, over containment, I'm quite convinced that he's very serious. I'm quite convinced that we'll see, as I said, an effort to find a diplomatic way out to show we've gone the extra mile. But I also think that's a process under Obama that will take place much sooner than it will under Romney. And if it runs its course, it means the prospect of the use of force would also be determined sooner than it would be with Romney. That sort of answers your question, but it sort of is reflecting my broader judgment that someone new coming in is going to take time to get to speed up on this issue, and is also not going to be in a rush to use force for different reasons. Now, the question will be, will the Iranians, once he's in, misinterpret that and think that his hesitancy or reluctance to use force, tough rhetoric, but not necessarily actions that match it, will that then make them feel, we're off the hook?
Thank you so much, Ambassador Ross. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.